Hello, welcome back. Today we are playing No Man's Sky and we are talking about disco. Let's do this. We're playing on relax mode, by the way, because I want to relax and I want to talk to you. So let's do this. So I want to start with an assertion that you've probably heard before, and that is that all art is political, and that is absolutely 100% true. Oh, my ship is still on fire. Some art is political because it's protest. Some art comes as a reaction from politics. Sometimes it's by a single artist, sometimes it's by a marketing team, sometimes it's discontent, sometimes it's pride, sometimes it's political on purpose, sometimes by accident. But art is always political because it always exists in a specific context. But disco is supposed to be fun and about enjoying oneself and enjoying the moment. So how is this political? And this. And this. Well, let's figure it out. Oh, here we go. Wow, look at the moon. Before we get into it, let's set the groundwork for disco. In 1960s, a generation came of age in an era of prosperity and promise. Really, things were not as good as they were promised. Woodstock turned into the year of the barricades. Flower power was gone, fried with the last tab of acid. Here we go. Haha, cool. Arrive in 9 hours, 10 hours? We have time, don't we?
Should we speed it up a little bit?
In 1965, the laws that governed immigration to the US were so relaxed that practically anyone who wasn't from Western Europe was allowed into the country. This drastically increased the amount of Asian people, Black people, and Latin American immigrants. They moved into the inner cities looking for jobs, and this made the locals kind of flee into the suburbs. This was a problem because the big spenders, those with a higher income, were not paying city taxes anymore. So with most of the heavy taxpayers gone, New York couldn't even keep up with the demands. And we have arrived. Alright, let's approach. In the 1960s, there were a lot of ideas about what the world was, about what kind of world we ought to live in. But whether it be race or class or gender, one by one these ideas kind of collapsed. MLK and Kennedy were assassinated on the same year. Okay, this was a pretty smooth landing. For my first time, not bad. Neverland, cool. Anyway, there was also a huge amount of the population who had gone to war, who came back to a country that had little space for them. They were given very little respect and authority. The promise they had been sold was a lie. So party culture, and later disco, was a retreat into the body, into carnal, irrefutable pleasure. Mindless, boundless, free. So cities were falling apart, and the ideas that people had been sold about peace and love turned out to be a sham. Yeah, get that copper. I feel like I'm in Minecraft. This made it so people had their own happiness where they could find it. Enter the nightclub.
I love that drink.
When we think about disco, the people we most often think about are the biggest celebrities and personalities like Donna Summer. But the fact is that people who were powering the world of disco were the club promoters and the owners and the entertainers. There was always a new place to visit, a new crowd, a new act, something to look at. Everyone was always trying to one-up each other. Part of the initial appeal of clubs was advertising the best experience, the best sound system, the best lighting effects, the best visual journey, but also, very important, the best music. Base computer, here we go. Oh, she's tiny, she's cute. Put her there right beside it. Oh, that's a shot of my crotch. Whoa. So this is Fortnite? Disco music arguably came from Europe, but that's with a very big caveat. Disco music was a scream from the US that later came back as an echo. Let me explain. What's for sure is that disco comes from Black and Latin music. Before the Second World War, the US had a strong underground culture of jazz and blues, the basis of R&B, and eventually, after the war, soul and funk. As the US became more international through trading, tourism, political alliances, or just, occupation, people got a helping of American culture. So you have these communities in Europe that are for the first time exposed to American music. American culture in general, it's kind of WandaVision when you think about it. So they are enthusiastic about that, but also about the new musical technologies that we're developing. The word disco allegedly comes from France, where nightclubs were called discotheques as a play on cinematheque. allegedly. So disco is kind of a pastiche of American culture, which is why it's spontaneous and cool and fun and shallow, really. So when this music came back to the US, it had instant appeal. So many of the recording artists who had inspired these people were now remaking their songs with the disco style. Perfect timing with the storm. Let's chill in here a little bit. Nice. Donna Summer and Giorgio Moroder kind of epitomize the identity of disco. A gorgeous, charismatic, talented American girl who epitomizes diva glamour, and a highly skilled, technical, and intuitive European producer with an appreciation of American culture. So the first people to adopt this new music and play it at clubs were naturally for black people. In the face of such oppression and poverty, artists were making music that expressed joy. When so many people in power are trying their damnedest to make your life miserable, expressing joy is absolutely a political move. This is what we call the pleasure principle. Pleasure as politics. But also, very important, disco was a success with a different crowd. The gays. Look at our little bass, it's a little sad, really. Gay bathhouses were an important step to establish a gay sexuality from the inside, a place where we get to choose our own identity, our rituals, our customs, and our behavior. It's widely believed that gay clubs started in Fire Island, which is hardly surprising. Minorities were segregated to their own safe spaces, so it makes sense that the party boys who had already claimed an island would make clubs for themselves. These were very elaborate. They had live music and entertainers, and they had themed nights, which is something very important. Let's put a pin on that. This gave clubs an air of performance which was mirrored in the ballroom scene and in drag pageants. Hippie music was very much about saving the world, we're all one people, peace and love, man. Disco music was about having fun. Grab yourself a mate and have a good night.
Dynamite fresh. That night, Sally and Tony paired off in a quiet corner. They've been head over wheels ever since.
Hippie identity, for how nonconformist it is, tends to create isolated echo chambers. Disco is about individuality. The freakier, the better. Disco is about exploring the pleasures of the body and seeing just how far you can take things. About breaking the bonds of shame and guilt. The complete and utter joy of being able to take pleasure from something that only a few years ago was forbidden. But gay clubs had a much bigger impact than just gay men. They became popular with women. A place for them to feel sexy without any fear, or well, at least less fear. But now that we're on the matter of the girls and the gals, there's an important development we need to acknowledge. In 1960, an absolute game changer was unleashed upon the world. The birth control pill. This gave women an incredible handle on their own sexuality. It made things a lot more accessible and simple and demystifying a little bit.
I think it's a very sensual city, a lot of exciting vibrations.
Women were allowed to play now, so to speak. So them and the gays were pushing forward a philosophy that was instrumental for the success of disco. The idea that sex was valuable for its own sake. Wow, look at the colors, dude. This game is very pretty. So let's recap for a quick second. What we've got in the blender right now is black identity with a European twist. A serving of gay culture and visual language, the gals, and a good helping of sexual liberation. A mix of gender, class, and sexuality. This all created an environment where minorities had safe spaces, but also where there was always something new and exciting to experience. The cool factor that disco gathered? Unclockable. There was a general discontent with the state of the world, so an escape was very welcome by tons of people who were white and straight. And with its inclusion to the mainstream, as it always happens, disco got kind of sanded off. The edges got softened a little bit. You had records that were less sexually charged, or even sung by Catholics. There were disco records marketed towards younger people, sanitized for teens and kids to enjoy. And of course, bands made by all white men. That's when you know you've gone mainstream. Because of mass media and movies like Saturday Night Fever, the dance floor also had an emulation aspect to it. People were seeing these figures on the screen and tried to be the best dancers of that song that they could, to pass as real dancers. Dancer realness, if you will. Now, eventually, all good things come to an end. For disco, it came as a mix of very disparate elements. movements. On one hand, many cities began to crack down on nightclubs. For example, in New York City, which was obviously disco capital, getting a liquor license became harder, and they enforced stricter zoning laws. It was just impossible to open a new nightclub. This definitely slowed down party culture, which was always looking for the next big thing. People are drawn into nightclubs because of the ecstasy of it all. People think it's never gonna get better than this.
I'm having the best time of my life here. This place is great.
Eventually, things go sour, and the cycle repeats. People want to have a good time, and often that's a costly endeavor. Gosh, that's so pretty, look at that. Then there was a movement called Disco Sucks, which I'm reluctant to talk about. It was a movement started with honest intentions. An immediate response to disco was punk. Disco glossed over real political issues while trying to have a good time. Pleasure as politics is not enough for punk. Punk is about community. It's about being responsible. It's about non-conformism. One has to take overt, direct action. Besides, they were aware that sex sells easily. So while POC and marginalized communities were finding real political power and rebellion through the unashamed enjoyment of pleasure and the body, there were many corporations that were just making banks of the backs of these people. This might be political. This, not so much. But then the Disco Sucks movement was hijacked by hatred. Homophobes and racists found a proxy to direct their hate towards. No, we don't hate black culture, we just hate disco. The Disco Sucks movement was primarily made of cishet males ages 18 to 35, which is hardly surprising. Now, I do think there is a genuine claim against disco, as much as I love it. When a cultural movement celebrates the good times and the pleasure of being alive, of being oneself, there's a whole bunch of people who are going to be excluded, whether it be by race or class or whatever. But if a good vibe is sustained for long enough, the reality that life is not a good vibe will sink in eventually. At one point, saying I love life while life gets tougher and tougher every day, it's just tacky. Especially when fresh blood enters the scene, they're usually angsty and angry, trying to find their own place in the world. And then they are met with this older crowd who are refusing to let go of the good times. Those groups are bound to clash. Disco Sucks didn't kill disco, that's giving it too much credit. As we've seen with many cultural movements through the decades, disco was killed by apathy. And killed is a strong word. Disco survives to this day, through dance music, through fun, through the club kids which inherited the ideas of being irreverent and colorful and loud. Disco lives on despite everyone's worst efforts. But for now, I want to put disco aside for a moment, and I want to tell you a personal story. A story of mine in which for 3 days straight I was convinced I was going to die, and then the night I reminded myself I am still alive. In September of 2017, there was a massive earthquake in Mexico City. I was alone at home when it happened, and I have never felt that fear. Everything in my house shook and made noise. I saw the walls tremble. I wasn't sure I would survive, but maybe more importantly, because I was home alone, maybe none of my family had survived. I was very lucky, and they all did, but it didn't end there. First off, earthquakes sometimes have sequels, so I was on edge for a long time, waiting for a comeback that thankfully never really happened. But the city was in shambles. There were fires, communications were down. It was a very distressing time. That night, and the following 3 nights, I went out and I volunteered my services for whatever helped. I wanted to get in the rubble and help clear buildings, but I didn't have my gains and I didn't have steel-capped boots, so the first night, I was relegated to managing queues. The second night, they let me handle the things that people were donating, the food and the canned goods. The third night, things were slowing down. So, despite me not being prepared for it, they allowed me to get into a pile of rubble and help clear it out. They took my arm and they wrote a phone number on it, that of my next of kin, and my blood type. They told me that it was in case I got injured that they could help me, or that if I died, they knew who to call. I knew that night could be my last. I was so afraid, and I lived with that fear for months. It gave me severe PTSD. It was hard for me to stay in rooms that didn't directly lead outside. If I had to go through a corridor or an elevator or a set of stairs, my heart started racing. At the time, my friend and I were getting into Drag Race, and for fun we would do drag in our homes, and we would pick a theme and we would do a look. It was a fun endeavor, it was a fun distraction. Eventually, my friend, who is thankfully much more connected to the local drag scene than I ever was, told me about a party that was taking place in the rubble of a building. An illegal underground nightclub. I was so ready for it. I said yes before she could even answer, and off we went. I wore a look that sadly doesn't fit me anymore, the shirt, be careful of your gains, but I was very proud of it. And I went, and I had so much fun. Drag queens complimented my outfit, which is honestly a really high accomplishment. I didn't make lifelong friends, but the people who were around me at the time were interested in me. I know it sounds morbid to party in the rubble of a building where you don't know what happened during the earthquake, but I think that's exactly what I needed, to look in the face of danger and certain death and decide to have fun. That was the first night I ever felt confident. That was the first night that I ever thought that people could be interested in me. My PTSD didn't get cured in that night, mind you, but it was an important step to move forward. Sometimes you have to look in the face of danger and say, I don't care about you, I'm still going to enjoy my life. Sometimes you have to look in the face of adversity and say, you are nothing to me. So it's important to bring it back to the real issues and not gloss over the political problems that disco readily overlooks. Punk was probably the best thing to respond to disco, but disco was a key moment in history. The evolution of it that we see today is dance music, house, electronic, rave, anything sexy and weird and abstract that gets your body moving, anything that's fun. You can say disco is shallow all you want, but in the face of adversity and noxious conditioning, the choice to not care and have fun, to me, is always political.